Hey, it's Jake. Welcome back to the SporeBloom art tutorials. Today we're going to talk about organics. I've got a whole bunch of design tips laid out for you, so I'm going to go through these one by one, and I'm going to draw over my designs here in order to demonstrate where I use them and how I thought about it as I was drawing them. So there's obviously the big picture things that we're gonna like hopefully fly right past, that are mechanical objects are more angular, have a lot more straights to them. Organics are more curvy, more natural in that regard, because a lot of things in nature are curved. They follow different rules, but here I want to get a little more specific. There's a lot of subtle things you can do that will bring a lot more life and originality to the design, and maybe make it just a touch more believable. Most of these are based on observations, I will say, of drawing from life, and they kind of just creep in over time, but I really do hope that a couple of these points will help you if you're currently working on organics or it's a big topic for you. So the first one I have outlined here is asymmetrical force. Now, asymmetry, pretty obvious, but what I think about first is I want to put a force into the object that will encourage asymmetry, along with a whole host of the other aspects we haven't discussed just yet. So that asymmetrical force might be, say, a growth spurt in the plant that makes it favor one side or the other. There's an asymmetrical hill on the right, top right plant. That's basically something that happens in nature, and you can make up whatever reason for it. Like maybe underneath the soil there's a lot of rocks here and the nutrients aren't as good, or there's not enough real estate, so the plant has a boom of growth spurt off to the side. With leaves, you'll find that plants will actually move their leaves so they get more sunshine. So if they're being blocked by neighboring plants, they'll actually stretch their branches or face their leaves a certain direction. So there's lots of reasons why this actually happens. Sometimes you might be growing on a slope, and that produces an overall asymmetrical force. So essentially, how that affects the design and makes it feel organic is that it's not perfect and ideal, and it makes things feel, I suppose, just imperfect on the big picture. You don't want to just skew or angle like the odd branch, but if you can do it to your whole object, it will give your whole composition a lot more life and gesture just by thinking of the force aspect of it. So let's move on to the next one, because a lot of these are going to be very related to each other, but they are distinctive thoughts and plans, so that's why I have them separated. Tilt is going to be pretty obvious. A lot of times it's the effect of the asymmetrical forces, but you want to have tilts to your overall object that will also break it from being, rigid and square. That's a terrible square. So where that's mechanical, you want to start sloping and slanting things, and it can apply to the entire object. Like I mentioned in the beginning, your force or your tilt could be an overall gesture that makes something feel more alive, like it gives it some movement. The tilt can be an overall gesture through the center of an object. It should be often juxtaposed with opposing tilts so that the object will retain some sense of balance between it. It was applied to the ground plane here, because the bottom right plant, let's face it, it's more symmetrical and it's more balanced at its core, but it's asymmetry in the lower portion and the tilt, I think, that saves it from being too flat. This could even be applied further on the base here. but there are some slight tilts and arrangements going on. So that brings us now to just general imperfections. This is going to be probably a lot more subtle. There's a big range of ways you can apply this, but if you think of like a flower growing, chances are that, you know, maybe one of the petals is going to be like, you know, a little bit curved, or maybe one of them's going to be missing. So you want to kind of apply that to these designs, because they're not just living in a glass jar, you know, they're probably in the real world. Things happen, you know, bugs might eat them, like they might, you know, not have the right nutrients during a certain stage of development. There's a whole host of reasons why they might be imperfect. These are things such as these little nicks in the fiber divisions of the outer structure. It might be how the epidermis of this lower protective surface under the roots of this plant, you know, bow out in certain places and curl in others. So a unique instance of an imperfection is going to stand out, and if you put it in the small areas, it's going to have a textural and subtle quality to it. But you can also scale this up to be a little bit larger. So the imperfections of the divisions here is very obvious that this side did not divide in the same way that the right side of that platform did. And there's a bunch of smaller arrangements of different imperfections in these kind of medium petal shapes that are happening here. Maybe some of these circles on the bottom right could be seen as imperfections because this object is not fully geometric and symmetrical. It could be that one little bend in your little filaments here that makes it feel like it deviates from the general structure, and therefore the imperfection is actually great. You know, this little swinging, twisting root, you could say, is kind of wrapping around, and it kind of breaks the mold of the other ones that are generally going, you know, unidirectionally from this point of view. And they're incredibly useful. They move your eye around the picture and add a whole lot of pattern and interest. So subtle transitions, this is when you want to go from one object to another. There's a whole bunch of ways to do it. I'm probably going to hit this in a separate video to describe all of the ways. But one idea is that you want to move from one shape to another, and you want to have it feel kind of natural. You don't want it to be artificial, because that's going to give a more mechanical feel. You know, you stack one object on top of another. It's not very organic. It doesn't feel like it's bound together and made of the same species or the same materials. So this is going to be in areas like these roots that are thinly wrapping around, kind of hugging the outside of this object. And not only do they relate to the spiky structure and the roots below, but they also transition from this, you know, halo of thistles that wrap around the bottom and kind of hold this object. They kind of transition around the whole thing and make it feel a little more unified. Transitions could be done using the shape and direction. Like I'm trying to get across that these filaments kind of grow inwards and then come back out through the top. So they kind of have a shape direction that repeats on the top and bottom. But there also is a transition point in the middle by using another object to add interest there. Another way we can see it is we're transitioning this big gourd or garlic shape that's sitting on the ground, and we're transitioning it into the ground. We don't want to just have it sitting there, so what we do is we cover it up. And we don't cover it up with just anything. It's a conscious effort to go from small petals on the bottom to maybe larger petals as we go up the object. And that's part of the subtle part of this one, is that if all the petals were the same size, it would feel very, mechanical and possibly too perfect. So the small petals could be new growths. If you see a budding tree, there's going to be a lot of new little sapling leaf growths, and there's going to be the more matured leaves that are photosynthesizing like crazy. You're going to always find that kind of establishment unless your plant's dying. So those kind of transitions are probably applied a lot of places that you can see subtly all over the place, from small to big, helping transition and make a natural transition from the ground all the way up to the top. So it could be seen as a repetition too. Next up, there's curves and straights. This is just a bit of a warning to not abandon straights when you're doing your organics, because straights are going to give some element of structure to your object, right? So this bottom right object feels really strong because it has all of these really straight spikes. The tilted platform on the left, it feels a little bit stronger. Like, despite it being this crazy thin, flimsy base, if you put a big platform on it, it's going to feel like it can take a little bit of a pressure. Straights might be due to the general cylindrical or conical nature of your object, so we want to try and utilize the straights of that side and not make it too bumpy and detailed. We also want to throw in maybe a straight on the same thing here. This object is generally very round, but that doesn't mean we can't apply a little bit of that asymmetrical force in order to produce a straight on that object. And they could also occur as texture lines. Some of these curving lines in here might hit a bit of a straight note. Could happen on the textural filaments in here as well. And the last one I want to point out too is that when you're dealing with vines and things of this nature that are generally just really meandering cylindrical forms, you kind of want to keep a straight on them sometimes. So some segments could be really curvy, but you want to keep a straight edge, and that's going to give them a lot of structure and a heck of a lot more interest. You'll probably find that looking at real branches too, that there are definite transitions from straights into curves as the object splits or takes corners or parts ways from the trunk, etc. So make it curvy, but don't forget about those straights, or it's just going to look like a bit of a blobby, weak mess. So radial symmetry is a very crucial thing, and it occurs in most organic plant, fungus matter, a lot of animals as well. Like sea stars come to mind. There's a whole lot of them. Essentially, you have an inside, and then you have some kind of radial division that can kind of lead you to these kind of cylindrical shapes. And I would kind of use that to your advantage. That's a very organically occurring thing. And it's going to give you a really dynamic range to play with. So the radial symmetry here, I'm still thinking of a central column that goes through this structure. And thinking about that radial symmetry allows me to make another platform here out of the center. And the cool thing too is that radial symmetry is a form of symmetry. So there's going to be some beauty in the repetition and the rhythm it makes. So the disc I just drew on the bottom, of course it has those petal shapes that are all radiating out, and that kind of makes the inside a natural focal point. You can see that's the direction that provides the petals here growing outwards. It's the divisions on almost on this structure that I just drew. You can see it somewhat in kind of spherical objects, but that's more like spherical symmetry maybe. But the principle is related, and you could probably apply that. And it carries through all the way to how these roots are tapping down into this liquid here, and basically it's forming a kind of a radial pattern on how they're connecting as well. So it's a little bit about just changing the way you're thinking about how things grow, and it becomes a common trait that you can really use. You start thinking like a 3D modeler about how you can extrude and bevel out new shapes that have this kind of radial pattern that kind of holds it all together. So the last thing is pretty obvious, I've been mentioning it all along, is using reference, and not only for shapes, but you also want to use it for the ideas. A lot of the organic concepts that I've come up with for this project are, of course, from real life facts and real ideas. You're going to want to use that because it's going to organically, sorry for the over organic pun use, it's going to actually make your concept be more organic, because it will talk about relationships between species, and it will give you ideas about the imperfections or how a plant might actually sprout and grow. And the other thing is the obvious shape inspiration that you're going to get. It's going to be organic shape inspiration, and if you look at it and replicate it using these tips in mind, you're going to be able to pull those shapes in, apply them, and maintain a really natural look to everything. And that about covers everything. So I hope you like these crazy plants, that a few of these tips might help you, and that you'll check in next time, because I've got a lot more things coming. Alright, thanks so much for watching.